Welcome to this first lesson. In this lesson we will discuss about improving your pieces, how you can recognize which piece to improve and how to do it exactly. Now, in this course we will talk a lot about exchanging the pieces, but quite often, for example, we'll need to exchange one of our worst pieces, and to do that we need to improve them and of course identify them along the way. This will also be discussed for the opponent. And diving right into the examples, we have this position on the board. If you like, you can pause the video and try to figure out what is white's plan, but also black's plan in this position. Okay, so out of all of white's pieces, the rooks, the queen and the knight, we're not exactly sure where we'll place the rooks. The C file is like semi-open file, but okay, black is solid at the moment. The queen is more or less fine on the d2 square, but this knight can be definitely improved. In general, for knights, we need to ask ourselves, are there any outposts in the position? The answer is yes. This knight can definitely be improved on the e5 square. Next, we want to make a plan how we can get that knight to d5 square. Keep in mind the position is semi-closed and we have enough time to do that. If there are a lot of tactics and contact between the pieces, we won't be able to do that because we will have more pressing matters in the position to attend to. In this case, to get to the e5 square, we can get there from f3. To get to f3, we can get there from g1 or e1. So the g1 is the closest square. We can play king h1, knight g1, knight f3 and knight e5. That will be a big improvement in our position by placing the knight on e5. That's why this is a very strong move, king to h1. Now that's for white. How about for black? Same scenario with the heavy pieces. However, this bishop is really bad on the c8 square. It's restricted by its own pawns. Now the question is what to do. How can it become active? If black foresees this upcoming plan that white has, black can actually rush to try to exchange that knight once it steps on the f3 square. So white really needs to hurry up and play king h1 right away. Because, for example, after something like rook c1, bishop d7, king h1, now white isn't on time. Bishop e8, knight g1, bishop h5, and when the knight steps on f3, black will exchange it, and white's advantage will be only symbolic. However, in the starting position, especially if white gets the knight on e5, white will have a big advantage. That's the difference. It will be great for black to exchange this bad light squared bishop. It will be done by first improving it on the h5 square and diagonal. So king h1, g5. This is an interesting try. As I said, bishop d7, black now isn't on time. The knight gets to the e5 square and it's very strong. We basically have a position where one player has a very strong minor piece against a worse minor piece. This will be discussed further on in the course. And if a move such as g5, f takes g5, queen takes g5, now the position changed. So besides e5, f4 is also an outpost. So we can play the move knight f4. Later on, white can continue with rook f3 and transfer the rook along the third rank. Okay, now we continue with another example. In this one, it's black to move. This is actually a game of mine. If you like, you can pause the video and try to figure out the right continuation. Okay, so when we are speaking about improving and exchanging pieces, now these topics are intertwined and will be discussed together quite often. Black has several pieces. Now, the heavy pieces is one topic, and The rook is relatively okay on the semi-open b file. This rook can be potentially improved on the e file, but still a lot of pieces on that file. The queen is doing relatively okay on c7. How about the minor pieces? This bishop is okay on e6. There is no improvement at the moment. This knight is on an outpost square on e5, also pretty good. This bishop, however, on e7 is a bit passive. It's not doing anything, and in order to get full control over this e5 square as an outpost, we need to eliminate white's best piece, which is the bishop on f4. It's a very active piece and controls the dark squares. So imagine if we exchange these two bishops. We'll get full control over d5 square, and we will get rid of our passive piece for white's most active piece, the only piece that's putting pressure on our position at the moment. The plan to do that is to play knight g6, bishop g3, and bishop f6, a very strong move and maneuver. We want to play bishop to e5 and exchange those bishops. c4 was played, a4, queen d2, and now I play bishop to e5. We have just made a big improvement in black's position. Knight to f4. White can choose to trade or to decline the exchange. If bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5 may be also possible, but we want to keep this square as an outpost. So this has been a big improvement because we also leave white with this bad bishop. This bishop is stuck and restricted within its own pawn chain, and in any potential endgames, we would like to have one of our minor pieces against that bishop, regardless if it's the knight or the bishop. Here it may be slightly preferable to have the knight because it's on a very strong outpost. So knight to f4, knight takes f4, bishop takes f4, a takes b3, a takes b3, and now I play a very strong move. If you like, you can pause the video and try to find it. It's the move c5. I'm fixing the pawns on the dark squares. The reason for that is because I foresee that the dark square bishops will be exchanged, and white will be left with this bad bishop on f3 against our better bishop on e6. I already have mentioned why the bishop on f3 is bad. And if white decides to decline the exchange and move this bishop to g5 or to e3, this bishop will be extremely strong on e5. That passive bishop on e7, like several moves ago, will control a lot of diagonals and a lot of important squares, such as the a1 square, which means that white can't contest black on the open a file. So bishop takes e5 was played, d takes e5, queen e3. Now arises the question again, what else can we improve? The rook is doing fine on the open b file, semi-open, putting pressure on the b3 pawn. The queen is fine at the moment, but this rook can definitely be improved. A very nice square for that rook is the d4 outpost. So rook d8, rook d1, and rook d4. Rook takes, pawn takes, queen d3, and f6. The idea of this move is, again, to keep improving the pieces. The bishop on e6 looks nice, but isn't doing too much. It can be rerouted to g6 to put pressure on the e4 pawn and on this whole diagonal. After that, we can also play queen e5 or queen f4 and try to put even more pressure on the e4 pawn. In the meantime, this bishop is stuck defending still after so many moves. h3 was played, queen a5, bishop d1, bishop f7, king h2, check, g3, and queen e5. King g2, rook a8, improving the rook. That rook will enter along the a file at some point. Queen e2, bishop g6, bishop c2, and rook a2. And suddenly Now all of black's pieces are active, so usually that means that there should be a tactic. Rook c1 and rook takes c2. Rook takes c2, bishop e4, king h2, d3, and my opponent played the move queen g4 and immediately after that resigned because after I take there is no perpetual check. Okay, now we move on to the next example. Now we continue with an example from Nakamura, and in this game he actually found a very nice idea of how to improve his pieces. If you like, you can pause the video and see how Nakamura did it. Okay, so it's good to note black's pieces. First of all, this knight on d5 is standing quite well, so it doesn't need to be improved, at least at the moment. This bishop is slightly passive, it's not doing anything, it's blocking the e-file, defending f7, d5, it's a bit stuck. This bishop, however, is also stuck. It isn't doing anything on g7, stares into its own pawn, and even if that pawn goes to f5, it will stare into a chain of pawns. It's not a great future. So, black needs to improve these two pieces. In the game, Nakamura played the move knight e7. The idea is actually quite simple. Bishop d5 or bishop c4. Black wants to improve that bishop. Also possible was to play bishop to f8 and bishop d6 to reroute that bishop on this long diagonal and also to activate it and to have a better scope, much better than on the g7 square. Now, after knight e7, the knight temporarily becomes a bit passive since it retreats, but after rook e2, bishop c4 with tempo, rook e1 and the knight goes back to d5. The knight became active again, but with the inclusion of improving the bishop. Queen c1, bishop f8. Nakamura now improves the other remaining pieces. Queen b2, bishop d6. Now the rooks are being exchanged. And Nakamura plays knight f4. Queen b1. And as usual, when all the pieces are in the game and in the attack, there is a tactic, and the move is knight to h3, after which white resigned. A very nice example by Nakamura of how you can improve the pieces and identify which pieces are passive. For example, this bishop was stuck, this bishop was also stuck, not doing anything, so it's about time to improve them. Sometimes even if it means retreating and taking a step back for the moment. Okay, now we get to this position. In this one is black to move. If you like, you can pause the video and try to figure out how to proceed. Okay, so this bishop is more or less okay on the e6 square. There is no immediate improvement of it. This knight can definitely be improved. It's not doing anything. On b6 it will put pressure on c4, but it's very nicely defended. On f6 it will be blocked by the pawn on f3, so it's also not doing much over there. It's also good to take a note which one is white's good bishop and which one is white's bad bishop. This bishop on e3 controls the outpost on d4 and the dark squares in general, because white's pawns are on the light squares and they control the light squares. This bishop controls the dark squares and it's a perfect harmony. This bishop, however, because the pawns are on the light squares, does the same job. So that's why it's the bad bishop and it's quite restricted from those pawns. It can be activated. Now back to the topic of the knight. Where should this knight actually go? As I have mentioned, d4 is an outpost. An outpost is a great square for a knight. The thing is, how can the knight get there? We need to think like d4. Which square, from which square is it possible to jump to that one? So we have f5, e6, c6, b5, and okay, these are in white's territory. So we can, well, more or less remove them easily. Now b5 is impossible, c6 is also impossible at the moment, f5, and e6 is the only one square which isn't controlled by a white pawn. So we should go to e6. The way to do that is to play knight f8 and knight e6 at some point. Also, this pawn is hanging from the queen potentially. So doing two things at once, black plays the move f6, defends the pawn, makes a retreat square for this bishop, and intends to play knight f8 and knight e6. After that, the knight can jump to d4 most likely, or even f4 potentially. To fight this, white can try the move g3, but then bishop h3 with tempo. Some idea of possibility of f4 potentially, but it doesn't change much. Black still wants to play knight f8, and even though white gets the rook to d5, this is the difference. With the light squared bishop, black can kick away that rook and basically force an exchange on d8. White can't do the same thing exactly, and it's very likely that white will give this dark squared bishop, strong bishop for this knight, and will remain with the worst bishop. So if f6, a4, bishop f7, and now the plan which I told you about. In this case, it's how tactics work for strategy. We only needed to calculate the idea basically to get the knight to the d4 square, as in it was a positional idea, and we only needed to employ tactics. For example, the move f6, defend the e5 pawn, and also to calculate after g3, potentially f4. That's why we have bishop h3 with tempo. Okay, now moving on to the next example. This is a very nice example from black. If you like, you can pause the video to try to figure out the solution. Okay, so this light squared bishop is quite good. It controls the light squares while the pawns control the dark squares. This dark squared bishop is a bit restricted, but it's not clear where we can actually improve it, at least for the moment. Maybe something with g6 and bishop h6. But this is a nice pawn structure which restricts this bishop and this knight. That's the f6 and d5 pawn structure. And if we play g6 too early, the opponent can consider the move g5 to break our pawn chain and activate these two minor pieces. So we'll be standing still on that side for the moment. Now the next thing is to consider the knight. The knight is a bit passive, it can go anywhere forward, but it has a very nice square in the position. That's the d4 square and the f4 square potentially. Both of those are quite good for the knight. Now the next question is how to get the knight there. And the answer to that question is knight to b6. This move is kind of with tempo because black wants to get rid of his double pawns. Because the king is on the d file, so b takes c4, knight takes c4 when the d pawn is pinned thanks to the king on the d file. So king e2, knight a8, knight e3, knight c7. This is a very nice journey for the knight. It will land on the e6 square, and then white will always need to worry about knight d4 or knight f4. And okay, black has a small advantage in this position, and it's a quite pleasant one. Next example. Improving the pieces. Again, the same topic. If you like, you can pause the video once again. Okay, in this position, white played the move bishop d1. What is the point of this move? So the bishop was blocked within its own pawn chain, well, pawn structure basically, and the bishop wants to go to d1 and then to b3 and to be active along this diagonal. potentially even sit on this very nice outpost square on d5, controlling a very big portion of the board. And of course it's being supported by the e4 pawn. It's an outpost. So bishop d1, and now it's very nice to note, at least practically, black's best option. Again, if you like, you can pause the video because this is a very interesting thing to remember. So if white manages to put the bishop on d5, white will have an undisputed positional advantage. After that, let's say black plays rook c8, bishop b3, and bishop d5. White can slowly improve the position. He play a4, a5. He can try to reroute the rook along the third rank, put some pressure on f7. The position will become quite difficult for black. White will have a very pleasant advantage. So to solve those problems, the best practical try is the move d5. Black simply gives up a pawn, which will also activate this bishop. It's very important. Bishop c5 is a possibility after this. And also it will eliminate the d5 square as an outpost for that bishop, at least for the moment. So after the move e takes d5, bishop d6, bishop e2, and okay, black still has some counterplay, potentially with bishop c5 later on, or f5, e4, pushing the pawns on the king side in the center, improving the rook also at some point. And white's advantage is just symbolic, like there is a pawn up, and okay, it's still a long fight ahead, but black definitely has better chances to make a draw in this one with some active defense than with the other one, this one, while being doomed to passivity for the rest of the game. Moving on, now I would like to show you one game of mine which I played against Stoikos Kiatsko. He is around 2200 rated at that time. It was played around 10 years ago, approximately. And it goes e4, c5, I'm black in this game, knight f3, knight c6, d4, pawn takes, knight takes d4, and I play the move e5. Now he takes on c6. This is not the main move, because after this move I can take with b takes c6 with the pawn, and I will control the d5 square, which was an outpost for white. Now also about whether to take b takes or d takes c6, in 90% of the time we want to capture towards the center. We strengthen the control over the center as we have now more pawns in it. So c4 was played. With this move, my opponent prevents the move d5, gains better control over that square, but in return weakens the d4 square permanently. So suddenly, because that's a dark square, we will eventually want to occupy it and place a piece over there, and with that we automatically get the idea to eliminate white's potential defenders of that square, namely this bishop on c1, this dark square bishop. So if we can actually exchange those bishops, it will favor black, especially thanks to the control over the dark squares. Knight f6, knight c3, bishop c5. As I have previously mentioned, now black immediately starts the fight for the d4 square. That's why not bishop e7, let's say. Bishop e2, d6, castle, queen e7, queen d3, bishop b7, bishop e3. Now it's an interesting moment because the opponent offers an exchange of the dark squared bishops. And black has a choice of several options. If you can like, you can pause the video and try to think what will you play in this position. Okay, so black has several moves. Black can choose to take on e3. Black can choose to retreat on b6 or b4. or black can choose to castle, as in do nothing about the bishop exchange. If black chooses bishop takes e3, there is f takes e3 and queen takes e3. F takes e3 doubles white's pawns, opens up the e file, and takes control over the d4 square and the f4 squares. It's an interesting option, but it will weaken the e4 pawn too much and double white's pawns, so probably not the best. Queen takes e3, the more logical option. It's also possible, and after that white will intend to double on the d file and put pressure on black's weak d6 pawn. The next option of bishop b6 is quite an interesting one, allowing white to exchange but on the b6 square, with the point that a takes b6 will fix even further black's pawn structure. Black will have 2 pawn islands in that case only, or actually 1 pawn island. The a7 pawn will not be weak anymore. The option that I chose in the game is to simply castle. I allowed this exchange, and now there is an upside and a downside. The downside is that these pawns are doubled and weak, but the upside is that it's still a middle game, not an end game, so I can actually use them and they can become my strength in the position. The things that I gained after d takes c5 is even better control over the dark squares and the d4 square as an outpost. So after queen e3, I'm guessing you can already find the plan for black. It is to put a piece on the d4 square. Now black has a choice, rook fd8 or rook ad8. Which rook would you choose and why? In the game I played rook fd8. The reason is quite simple. Usually we would like to include this rook from d8, from a8, sorry, because it won't do anything on the queen side and this part of the board. But rook fd8 is actually a multi-purpose move. First of all, we improve the rook from f8, and second, which is even more important maybe, is that we are freeing the f8 square for the knight. The knight has a very nice route with knight d7, knight f8, knight e6, and then probably knight d4 or knight f4. One of these two squares. Most likely d4 because it's a very nice outpost. Rook fd8, bishop f3, overprotecting the e4 pawn, but the bishop is quite passive in all scenarios. It's being restricted. It's white's worst minor piece. Rook d4, b3 defending the pawn on c4, and rook ad8. My opponent always wanted to play the move knight e2, but that's why he played bishop f3. But it's not easy because I can play rook d3. I'm always on time. Rook d4 attacked c4, and rook d8 and threatening rook d3 at some point. So he decides to play knight a4, and basically paralyzes my rook because moving the rook means that I will lose the c5 pawn. He puts pressure on it. And now if you like, you can pause the video and try to figure out black's plan. So this was the plan as I mentioned before, but if I do that right now, with knight d7, knight f8, my opponent can play the move bishop g4. What's the idea of that move? After knight e6, white would really much like to take on e6. He will exchange his bad minor piece for the knight, which can be an extremely strong minor piece. It's an exchange which favors white. So first I play the move bishop c8. I'm not rushing with this maneuver. I'm improving my bishop. It was blocked looking at the pawn on c6, so it's definitely a good move. He plays h3. And now this move may seem insignificant, but it's actually giving black an extra plan. Again, if you like, you can pause the video. Okay, so that plan is actually quite interesting. The pawn on h3 creates a hook against white's king. Black can try to open up the g file with g5, g4. And this is a big difference because in the game, now I play the move king h8, and after rook e1, rook g8. I intend to play g5 and g4. and to start an attack against the king. My opponent panics a bit and plays the move g4. This is a bit too early, in my opinion. He should have waited for g5 at least. Now after g4, when the pawn structure changes, everything changes again. The king has been even more weakened, and the f4 square also became permanently weak. The bishop on f3 is even worse. I go back. Rook d8, bishop g2, and I play the move h5. It's good to mention that this maneuver is also good enough. With h5, I simply want to win a tempo, meaning that if g5, knight h7 wins a tempo on the g5 pawn, knight f8, after h4 let's say. So he plays f3, defending that pawn. I play knight h7. I want to reroute the knight, whether like this or like this, as I have mentioned before. Rook e2, knight g5, rook f1, knight e6, rook c2, and knight f4. That knight on f6, which wasn't doing anything several moves ago, is actually now a very good piece in the position. Queen f2, knight d3, queen e3, and queen h4. Now it's about improving the queen. All the pieces are becoming active. Knight c3, knight f4, queen f2. Now we have a choice whether to accept or decline the exchange. Exchanging the queens and entering an endgame, black will still retain the advantage and it will be a very pleasant endgame, but at the moment my queen is more active than his queen and I'm attacking, so I have an option also to preserve the queens, so I play the move queen g5. But keep in mind that queen takes f2 also favors black. King h1, rook d6, including this rook in the game via the 6th rank. So he plays h4. If he didn't play h4 after rook h6, h takes g4, white will be in a bit of trouble. He tries to handle it tactically and plays h4. Queen g3 defends the g4 pawn, but allows rook d2, an infiltrant along the d-file on the 2nd rank. We exchange the rooks. He plays rook f2 to defend his bishop. I exchange the rooks. I take on g4. Bishop takes g4. I win a pawn. And then I improve my queen with queen d4, and now all of my pieces are standing well. They are dominating the board, while this bishop is still quite passive, doomed to passivity and defending the e4 pawn for the rest of the game. And this knight is on the edge of the board, putting pressure on c5, but it's not very effective because the queen is extremely strong. I went on to convert this endgame, and you can find that in the PGN file. Thank you for watching.